Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Welcome aboard, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Democracy Exchange with the DePo, the one-stop station where we engage in conversations to foster understanding. I'm your host, Samantha Conrad. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Kalaf-Hughes. She is going to be sharing insight on IVF and its role in the upcoming presidential election. Dr. KH, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Before we get too far into the discussion here, I'm going to give a brief overview on what IVF is. So, for those of you that don't know, IVF, or in vitro fertilization, is a procedure in which eggs are removed from a woman's ovary and combined with the sperm outside the body to form embryos. Those embryos are then grown in a lab and they are frozen for future use. It's typically used as a treatment for infertility. And now we're going to move on to Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, who has done research on IVF. So my first question for you is, what kind of drew you to IVF and why are you so passionate about it?
IVF has become increasingly common around the country in the last 15 to 20 years. And every year it gets a little bit more common and used for a variety of reasons, from people who experience infertility due to cancer treatments, people who are infertile for a variety of other reasons, both men's and women's infertility issues. And the increase in frequency and the fact that it overlaps with a lot of policy areas that we have seen an increase in efforts to legislate, like abortion and birth control, makes it really interesting. Additionally, because it has become so much more common as our technology has improved, it has become something that affects a lot more people. So it's not limited to a small subset of the population anymore. This is becoming increasingly common. And you have people traveling all over the country and all over the world to access IVF care and fertility care in a way that is affordable for them.
So I know that you said that legislation has increased around IVF and it's become more popular in the legislative eye. Why do you think that IVF is an important topic of political research specifically?
So IVF kind of flew under the radar for a long time from a legislative standpoint. Efforts to legislate it were primarily around insurance mandates, and so questions of whether insurance would cover fertility treatment and the components that go into IVF procedures. What changed was earlier this year when Alabama, in a court case that didn't necessarily have to do with access to IVF, but unintentionally destroyed embryos, essentially declared that life began at conception when they declared that embryos could be seen as people under the eyes of the law. That instantly elevated it to the national stage because that brought an immediate and abrupt halt to all IVF and fertility procedures in the state of Alabama. And it also made it so that people who had embryos frozen and even eggs frozen in Alabama couldn't transfer them out of state because no one wanted to carry that legal risk. And so that kind of elevated it to the national stage in a way that we haven't seen in the past. IVF is very much linked with efforts to legislate reproductive health care, abortion, and birth control in a way that we don't often think, because typically, even if someone wants to restrict abortion, they don't really want to touch, from a political standpoint, fertility treatments, because fertility treatments are always used to grow someone's family, and it's such a personal decision that it's not necessarily politically palatable. Then Alabama went there, and that was not well received even by very conservative individuals or very conservative states, because it's kind of a political lightning rod. Even if you oppose abortion, even if you oppose birth control, opposing someone who wants nothing else to grow their family and can't through no fault of their own is just not politically popular.
Yeah, I know that case was very controversial, and just so there's no confusion here, why would someone choose IVF as a means to have children as opposed to other types of fertility treatments?
So there's a lot of different reasons. For people who undergo cancer treatment and chemo, either men or women, that can prevent you either from having eggs that can actually be usable. It can affect the sperm. And so at that point, you may, before you do invasive cancer treatments, you may need to freeze your eggs or create embryos to use at a later date after your cancer treatments are done. So that's one reason. Another reason is there are a variety of reasons that people become infertile, and it could be an ectopic pregnancy when your fallopian tube bursts and it takes out the other tube, and at that point you can no longer have children without IVF. It could be endometriosis, it could be PCOS. There's a variety of issues issues that happen, like for women, where it causes infertility, and the same for men with other issues that cause infertility for that reason. It can also be used if you are the carrier of a genetic disease, either cancer or a whole host of genetic diseases that are not often thought of as either being compatible with life, or that would lead to short and painful lives, or that would lead to like a devastating cancer diagnosis. You can screen the embryo to see if it is a carrier of that. And then if it is a carrier of that, you can choose not to transfer it. And you can either leave it frozen, or there's a variety of other options, but you can choose not to transfer that embryo. And then there's a lot of reasons that people cannot become pregnant that are just unexplained. It's called unexplained infertility, and we don't really know. And so people can turn to IVF for that reason. There's also a whole separate, like, not necessarily an infertility issue, but the LGBTQ population who wants to grow their family. If you are in a same-sex relationship, you may need to turn to fertility treatments. Could be IVF, it could be a variety of other treatments to grow your family that way. And so there's a lot of reasons that people would access IVF, and it doesn't stand in isolation. You don't get IVF without birth control. And so birth control is a necessary part of the procedure. And so because of that, it touches on a lot of aspects of how we legislate reproduction in the US.
I know that you mentioned when you were discussing the Alabama case that one of the reasons why that was so controversial is because IVF has rapidly grown in popularity over the past few years since its inception. I read a statistic that said that as many as 2% of babies or children born in the United States as of 2022 were born through IVF. Why do you think that number has increased so much since it was first conceived?
So a couple different reasons. Part of it is because people are having children later in life, and the later you have kids, the less, you're right, we all know that fertility declines. And a lot of that has to do with both the cost of having families and just giving people a little bit more flexibility. So that's part of the reason. Another part of the reason is that we do have an increase in the incidence of infertility, and we don't yet know why. So part of it has to do with more people are experiencing infertility. We just don't actually know why yet. And the other part is that it's just more accessible. The science has grown. There are a lot of ways that we can assist in growing families and creating families now through science that just didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. And because it has become so much more accessible, people are using it. Additionally, you do have some states now, I think the number is 21, that do require some level of insurance coverage for infertility. And so if you have insurance coverage, the procedure becomes significantly more accessible. Without insurance coverage, each round of egg retrieval and transfer is usually about $20,000 to $30,000 with no guarantees. And so with insurance coverage, it does make it a little bit more accessible. And so people are able to grow their family in that way, or try to grow their family in that way, because it becomes something that is available, where 20 or 30 years ago, while the science was there, the access really wasn't.
Circling back to that accessibility point, with the recent decision made by the Alabama Supreme Court in February of this year, how do you think that's going to impact IVF accessibility in the state of Alabama in the future, and how has it impacted it now?
So what it did is it brought everything to a screeching halt. In probably the worst possible way if you happen to be someone in Alabama who was undergoing fertility care. What it did is, so the way IVF works is you essentially take a bunch of hormones, and that allows your ovaries to produce more eggs. Instead of just the one egg a month, you produce pretty much as many as your body will actually carry. Those eggs are then extracted from your body through a surgical procedure, and they are fertilized outside, as you said earlier, in the lab, usually frozen, and then essentially, once the body is then again prepared, which usually involves putting the body into artificial menopause, putting the person on birth control, and then transferring the embryo back in, it's through another multi-week process of extremely invasive medical procedures and expensive medications. What the Alabama decision did is it stopped IVF procedures immediately, which means you had people and families who had taken all this medicine, embryos were about to be thawed, people who were going in for their transfer that day or next week who were essentially told no. Which meant people had spent tens of thousands of dollars, and then they were just stuck with no idea of when they would be able to access their embryos. You also had people who lived out of state who were trying to transfer their embryos out of Alabama who were also told no, which put a bunch of embryos into a kind of a purgatory. And some of these people don't have the ability to generate more embryos because either they've undergone cancer treatment or their body can't make any more. And so it stopped everything immediately. The legislature in Alabama realized that they had entered politically unsavory waters because they pretty much took national criticism for this, even from Republicans. And so they tried to walk it back a little bit by essentially saying, well, we're not going to prosecute doctors if things go awry, because you do lose embryos in the thaw. There's no guarantee that when you unfreeze an embryo for transfer that it will survive. In the same way that there's absolutely no guarantee that when you try to get pregnant the traditional way that it will work. There's very few guarantees in reproduction. So most doctors then essentially just stepped back, and they had to consult with their insurance providers to see if they could continue to offer these services. Some clinics, once they kind of walked this back a little bit, some clinics did reopen, some did not. But for the people and the families that were affected immediately, they essentially had to start over. They had already put their bodies through a hormonal, expensive roller coaster, and then they had to start over. And that's expensive and it's time consuming. And it's devastating when someone has spent years of their life trying to grow their family and just have had absolutely no luck. And so what we have seen in states that Alabama is kind of on the strange end of this because they've jumped the shark more than anyone else in a rapid fashion. But we've seen an exodus of providers. And you see this in states with really restrictive abortion bans as well, like Idaho, where providers leave the state. They don't want to practice in a state where they're not allowed to provide patient care, or the risk of providing necessary patient care opens them up to both personal and professional liability. And that's what's going to end up happening, I think, with IVF, is that you're going to end up with providers leaving the states and people having to travel to other states to do these procedures, or moving their embryos to other states where they think the environment is going to be more favorable. The problem is there's no guarantees. And so if you move your embryos to a state where you think the political environment is safe, and then the political environment changes, someone could essentially be in a situation where they have embryos, the embryos are on ice, but they cannot access them. And their choice is then either to continue to pay for them, because you pay freezer rent, essentially, to continue to pay for them, or to stop paying. And if you stop paying, then essentially it's up to the company or the state as to what to do with your own genetic material. And that gets into a place that I don't think most state legislatures want to go. But if they haven't thought down the game tree as to what happens when they start restricting this, it's going to be where we end up. Abortion and reproductive health care broadly, including IVF, are regulated in a way that we don't regulate other healthcare procedures. And so there's a lot of both uncertainty and a lot of policy made by non-experts. And so you end up in these kind of strange situations. And I think it's important to note that part of the reason that Alabama went this way is because it was an effort through the courts to essentially get us to embryonic personhood, or this idea that life begins at conception. And if we get this idea where life begins as soon as sperm meets egg, whether it's in the body or in a lab, at that point, then all of our reproductive health care pretty much comes to a screeching halt. And so that's been a long time goal of a lot of more conservative states. But again, they just haven't really thought down the game tree as to what that looks like on the ground. And you can talk about it from an idealized perspective of like, well, life begins at conception, everything is sunshine and rainbows. But when it comes to how it actually plays out and affecting real people, you end up with situations like what happened in Alabama.
So while we're on the topic of controversial decisions made by courts, let's talk a little bit about the 2022 Dobbs decision, which, for those of you who don't know, it essentially overturned Roe v. Wade to make it up to the state to decide as to what to do with abortion. And this very controversial decision has kind of reshaped the way that we talk about women's healthcare and fertility healthcare in general. Do you think that that had an impact on the way that, as a country, we discuss and talk about IVF?
Definitely. And partly because efforts to overturn Roe were primarily theoretical for years. As soon as Roe passed was decided in 1973, there had been efforts to overturn it, but these were all theoretical, and no one actually believed that there was this real chance that this would happen and that the effect would be so immediate. We know that the effect has been immediate. It has had huge implications to women's health care, accessing care. Maternal mortality has gone up. Infant deaths have gone up. And we know that like the health outcomes aren't great. From an IVF perspective, the really interesting thing about both the Dobbs decision was in Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion. He actually cited the right to birth control as a case that should be essentially re-examined by the court, implying that there is no right to privacy in the Constitution. And if there is no right to privacy, you don't get birth control, and you don't get access to reproductive health care. IVF can't really happen without access to birth control. And in IVF, there is always a risk of losing an embryo, because either through the thaw, or it doesn't really become an embryo, or it just doesn't form correctly. All of the things that happen naturally in life. The only problem is that when it's happening in a lab, there's someone to blame. And while we have seen instances of women being arrested for their pregnancy going awry, or essentially being punished for miscarriage, the risk of that in a lab isn't something that we're necessarily willing to take. And so if we don't have a right to privacy, and if we don't have access guaranteed across the country to reproductive health care, then it's going to kind of limit your access to IVF, or only certain people are going to be able to access IVF. And there are a number of people who will argue that abortion isn't healthcare, but they're wrong. This is one of those things that's kind of clear, is unfortunately pregnancy does not always go well. And there are a number of medical reasons when abortion is absolutely necessary, and it is the standard treatment. And when you deny people abortion care in those instances, essentially the option is hoping for the best once they go septic, or death. And that's actually what got Ireland to reverse their longtime ban on abortion, was the very public death of a woman who was septic, and the hospitals were faced with the option of doing nothing. And then she died. And that essentially galvanized Irish opinion to legalize abortion. We haven't really seen that in the US, because even prior to 1973, when Roe was decided, abortion wasn't illegal in the way that it is now in some states. And so there was a lot more flexibility for physicians, but that flexibility doesn't really exist anymore. And so you have physicians leaving or opting not to provide care. And there have been a number of documented cases of women left to go bleed out at home or wait until they're septic before receiving that care. Fertility treatment is elective. You will not die if you do not have children. And so because it is such an elective procedure, even though we want everyone to be able to grow their families, it's a political lightning rod because we want everyone to grow their families, but it's less of a life or death situation than other aspects of reproductive health care. But if we limit those those other avenues of reproductive health care, we will in turn limit IVF, even unintentionally. If you limit access to birth control, IVF goes away. If you put penalties for an embryo essentially stopping growing in the thaw, IVF goes away. If you have penalties for healthcare providers or people who ship medications, IVF goes away. And so if we don't want IVF to go away, then there needs to be some sort of political support for it to stay. As of right now, what we've seen, overwhelmingly, Republicans have voted against protecting IVF a number of times in Congress. And you get a really interesting tension here between what people say on the campaign trail and what they do in reality. And what they say on the campaign trail often is that they support IVF, they want people to grow their families, and then they immediately return to DC and vote against it. If you look at what the research suggests, because I promise this is not just all me, thinking my deep thoughts and sharing them. What the research that I've done with colleagues, formerly at Penn State and at Clark, is that a lot of the state level protections for IVF come from female Democratic state legislatures. Legislatures with a larger proportion of women serving, particularly if those women are Democrats, tend to get more protections and more insurance mandates and more support for IVF. It's not always that they pass. The legislation passes. Those states with female Democrats do tend to pass a little bit more, but it changes the conversation and the issues come up more for discussion in states with more female Democrats than without. So it's a kind of a benefit to, if you want IVF to even be discussed, it's kind of a benefit to electing women. Because even though fertility issues affect both men and women, it tends to be an issue that women bring up more than men.
how do you think, I know that you've said that there are a lot of states that are going to, that you predict in the future that are going to do away with IVF and a bunch of other fertility treatments in general, but how do you think that this Dobbs decision is going to affect affordability of IVF in the states that do decide to keep it?
So I don't know if the states will necessarily do away with it. I doubt you'll see explicit IVF bans just because that's not politically popular. What I think could happen is it just becomes more difficult to practice medicine in those states and the providers leave. In the states that do have it and that where it is protected and where it is accessible, you will end up seeing the people who can afford it traveling to those states to access it. And you already see a little bit of that now. People travel all over the country because these procedures are so expensive that people do travel all over the country to do that. And they also travel for which clinics have the best success rates. There's a lot of nuance to fertility treatment, and it's not a one-size-fits-all practice. And so people will travel for the places that have the best success rate and the best chance of having what's referred to as a live birth. And that data is all publicly available. It is collected by the federal government and it is publicized. So that clinic data does exist. And so people will end up traveling. We know people are already traveling for other aspects of reproductive health care. And I think you'll probably see a little bit more of that. You will also see, my guess is, people continuing to order their drugs from overseas. A lot of people order medication for IVF procedures from overseas because medication that could be, $10,000 or $11,000 per dose in the US, you can get from the UK for $200. And so people order those medicines from overseas and then use them in conjunction with their clinics in the US. And so I could see kind of more of a telehealth thing popping up with medicine coming in from overseas. The only problem is that for IVF, you do have to get frequent scans and frequent blood draws. So it may be a situation where in some places you're getting the blood draws and you're getting the scans locally, but the reproductive endocrinologist that you are working with is in another state. There are a lot of ways to get around this, but it is going to be one of those things that is only going to be accessible for the people who have more wealth. And while that's true now, and it's particularly true with healthcare in the US generally, I think we're going to probably see a little bit more of that as we start to see more of a women's healthcare gap in some of these states.
And why do you think that there is such disagreement in the Republican Party as how to approach IVF? And do you think that that will have an impact on the way that red or Republican states handle IVF in the future?
I think they're going to want to avoid it. If I was a Republican legislator from one of those states, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. There's no good outcome here because a lot of these people have used IVF to build their families. They have friends and family members who have used IVF, and you do not get IVF without access to birth control and abortion. It's just, you need them essentially for these procedures. You need access to this type of reproductive health care. Embryos die in the thaw. Eggs don't become embryos even when mixed with perfect sperm. So it's just not, everything doesn't work like we want it to all the time. And so from a personal standpoint for them, they may feel one way about it. From a fundraising and ideological standpoint, they may have to feel very differently if they want to keep their job. Most people don't understand the intricacies of healthcare. Most people are not physicians. Most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about IVF until they're told they need it. And so it's very easy to be like, oh yeah, that shouldn't be a thing until you want to access it. And we know the same is true with abortion care generally. But IVF is a little bit different. It's less of a morality policy. It occupies more of kind of a moral gray area because it is used to grow families. And so while I think Republican legislators and what we've kind of seen in the data is they don't want to touch it because either they support it and they can get primaried from the right, and someone even further to the right can say, look, they support, all sorts of weird things. They support, birth control or abortion, or they'll accuse people of using it to support eugenics and that kind of stuff. But if they vote against it, it becomes essentially a situation where they have constituents who are like, why are you trying to prevent me from growing my family? And so for them, it's much easier if they say nothing. For Democrats, it's an easy issue. because they can say we support IVF, they can vote that way, they can show that way, and they can show essentially what happens. And the Alabama decision was a great example of what happens when you have a decision like Dobbs, because it does truly leave things up to the states, and states can make any decisions that they want as long as they're following essentially the U.S. Constitution. And so in this instance, Alabama went there and people were like, oh, too much too soon. And you end up with a situation where you have a decision that people just haven't really thought of the implications for. Because there's no way to there. I mean, there was a way to see that coming, but they decided to ignore it. And what do you do? What do you do when you have freezers full of embryos that people can't access? Who pays for that? What if they stop paying? Do you destroy them? If you've destroyed them, have you just committed murder? I mean, well, if they're all people, yeah. So who pays for that? Who funds it? What do you do with a situation like that? And we just the laws in states that are trying to legislate that have not quite caught up with that because it's just politically unpopular. It doesn't follow the same morality and value-laden policy that the research has shown abortion does, because infertility affects everyone. It doesn't care if you're a Democrat. It doesn't care if you're a Republican. It doesn't care if you're an independent. And so it's one of those policies that's just a lot harder than we typically deal with in the public. And because this ends up in the public, we get a little stuck.
And this is just a follow-up question to that. I know that, like you said, the Alabama Supreme Court decision was very unpopular, but I know that there are a lot of Republican states that share similar sentiments to that of Alabama. Do you see the Alabama Supreme Court decision being like a one-off thing, or do you think in the future there could possibly be legislation from other states or court decisions from other states that would coincide with that?
My guess is it's going to be a one-off for now. I don't think they realize the amount of political pushback that they would get. And I think they've now started to realize, possibly, though I'm not sure, states do strange things all the time, that if you decide that life begins the minute sperm meets egg, then that's the end of IVF. It could also limit some types of birth control, but that's the end of fertility treatments. And if that's the end of fertility treatments, I mean, it won't stop them. People will go to Europe, which they already do. But it's not going to be a politically popular choice, particularly in a space where people are having children later and people do want to grow their families. And so it's going to be very politically unpopular. The other option that you may see, and that some states have tried to legislate, though not with success, is that they've said that life begins at conception unless it's in a lab. So if it's an embryo created in a lab, then it's not life. But if it's an embryo created in someone with a uterus, then it is life. The problem there is those are logically inconsistent. And so they tend to not get a lot of traction because an embryo can't be life in one space and not life in another space if you believe it's actually life. And so they've tried a little bit of that. The problem with that is then it becomes pretty obvious that that's more of a goal of controlling women than it is of any type of protecting life. And while it's not, these policies are not always ideologically consistent, that one's a little more obvious than most. IVF is just incompatible if you're going to argue the minute sperm meets egg, it has the rights of a person. Because the risks are just too high for the physicians.
And I know that both Trump and Kamala Harris have discussed IVF in their 2024 campaigns. Trump in particular has made claims that are inconsistent with some members of the Republican Party, but then consistent with others, which is why there's the controversy in the Republican Party as how to handle IVF. If Trump wins the 2024 election, how do you see that impacting the world of IVF?
I think it really depends on what state someone lives in. If Trump were to win and if Trump were to end up with a Republican majority Congress, that would be pretty problematic for reproductive health care generally, and so likely for IVF as well. And problematic in the sense that if there is the political will for a national abortion ban, which if there was a Republican majority Congress, there likely would be, or some sort of national law that says life begins at fertilization, it's going to make fertility treatments everywhere a lot more difficult. I I don't know that the numbers within Congress, I don't know if getting that supermajority is likely based on what kind of demographics and numbers look like. And so I don't know if that's as immediate of an issue, but I'm wrong all the time about that. And I was really pretty sure that they wouldn't actually throw precedent out and overturn Roe v. Wade. So I could be very wrong about that. I think the risk comes not directly from IVF. I don't think you're going to see Congress be like, oh, we should ban this because it is such access to it is so popular. But I think the risk comes to it from more incremental things that might decrease access unknowingly. So like the Alabama decision, when they made that decision, I don't think they were necessarily like, ooh, bonus, we can ban IVF. But I just don't think they thought down essentially the game tree of what happens. Because if you're a physician, you can't practice without malpractice insurance. If you have all this personal and professional risk, you're not going to practice there. So you're just going to stop. If you're a shipping company that ships embryos, and what happens if your truck gets in an accident or something, right? You're not going to take that risk. And so I think the risk is more there. I think the risk to reproductive health care broadly is probably a little bit higher. But a lot of this stuff could end up getting decided by the courts because you have states like Ohio that have essentially enshrined a right to abortion, birth control, and fertility treatment in our state constitution. And if the federal government were then to make a change where the state constitution conflicts with federal law, it would end up in the courts. And so these would be long, drawn out legal battles.
Well, Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, thank you so much for your insight today. And we have made our last stop at the Democracy Exchange with the DePo. I would like to, once again, thank Dr. Kalaf-Hughes for being here today and for providing such valuable insight on IVF because it is a very salient issue, and I think it's an important issue, so thank you. And thanks to the DePo social media and podcast team, Margaret Kolonsky, Samantha Perry, and Maria Letieri. And special thanks to Falcon Radio and Professor Robert Alexander, our founder. I've been your host and researcher, Sam Conrad. Join us next time at the Democracy Exchange. And to find the video version of this podcast, you can find us on our YouTube page at BGSU DePo and for the rest of our socials. Bye for now.